On paper, the Vietnam War was going well. Briefings were clean, the graphs were rising, the enemy kill counts looked promising. All the reports said progress. And then, in April of 1975, as North Vietnamese forces were closing in, the last American helicopters quickly lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, part of the largest helicopter evacuation in history. That gap between the numbers and reality is the whole story. And at the center of it all was Robert McNamara. Because Vietnam was not just a military defeat, it was a failure of measurement. It was the moment America discovered that a war can look successful on a spreadsheet and still be collapsing in the field. Robert Strange McNamara was born in 1960 in San Francisco. He studied economics at Berkeley, earned an MBA at Harvard, and at age 24, he was one of the youngest assistant professors at Harvard, teaching accounting and statistics. McNamara came of age just as systems analysis and the first programmable computers were reshaping how America handled complexity. He was part of a generation seized by a single idea. If you can measure it, you can manage it. When World War II broke out, McNamara joined the U.S. Army Air Corps, not as a pilot or as a soldier, but as a statistician, assigned to the newly formed Office of Statistical Control, operating inside the Pentagon. McNamara's job was to bring efficiency to the massive logistics of U.S. bombers in the Pacific, from sortie rates, fuel consumption, to payload productivity. And he was brilliant at it. By 1945, working alongside key American General Curtis LeMay, McNamara helped architect one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in the history of warfare. The data showed something that conventional wisdom hadn't caught up to yet, that high-altitude bombing over Japan was failing. Jet stream winds and cloud cover were just destroying accuracy at 30,000 feet. So McNamara recommended the unthinkable. Drop the B-29s down to 5,000 feet, load them with incendiaries, and hit the shadow factories hidden inside Japan's dense residential neighborhoods, where the buildings were made of paper and wood. Essentially burn them out. And the results were devastating. Over a 5-month campaign, 67 Japanese cities were firebombed, destroying up to 60% of Japan's urban areas. Japan's war machine was crippled. The planned Allied ground invasion, projected to cost millions of casualties on both sides, never came. In McNamara's ledgers, it was a success. It shattered civilian morale, caused massive loss of life, and accelerated Japan's surrender, setting the stage for the atomic bombings in August, with Japan surrender on August 15, 1945. During the war, McNamara developed a negative view of the majority of officers. LeMay was an exception, because they largely refused to cooperate with his analytical work. But the lesson McNamara drew from the Pacific was not one of moral complexity. It was one of methodology. The numbers worked. The data delivered when the pilots and commanders were wrong. And the man walked away believing that quantitative analysis was really the only objective truth that mattered. When the war ended, McNamara and 9 fellow Harvard-trained statistical officers were hired by the Ford Motor Company. They called themselves the Whiz Kids, and Ford was desperate enough to let them loose. The company was hemorrhaging money, its management was chaotic, its record-keeping a disaster, and its production lines just overall inefficient. McNamara changed all of that. He installed rigorous financial controls, he imposed systematic reporting structures, he demanded measurable outcomes at every level of production. By 1960, he had risen to become president of the Ford Motor Company, one of the first people outside of the Ford family to hold that title. He was there for exactly 5 weeks when he received a phone call from the president-elect of the United States. John F. Kennedy, having read about McNamara's brilliance in Time magazine, wanted him in Washington. McNamara became Secretary of Defense in January 1961, and he brought everything with him: the spreadsheets, the systems analysis, the unshakable belief that management was the answer to every problem, including war. His first visit to South Vietnam was in 1962, where he told the press, "Every quantitative measurement shows that we are winning the war."
I believe I'm correct in saying that in the past 4.5 years, the Viet Cong, the communists, have lost 89,000 men killed who could be recruited, trained, and sent back to fight in South Vietnam.
He was brilliant, confident, he was exactly the kind of man Washington loved. But he was walking into exactly the wrong war for his particular genius. Vietnam was not just a battlefield. It was a political struggle, a civil conflict, a post-colonial crisis, and a nationalist war all at once. The French, trying to regain its colony after World War II, had already fought and lost there at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. After that defeat, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided the country at the 17th parallel, with plans for reunification during the 1956 elections. But the division was unstable from the start. The US and the state of Vietnam in the South did not sign the agreement, fearing a communist election victory. This, combined with the failure to hold the 1956 elections, directly led to the Vietnam War. The United States did not enter Vietnam all at once. It escalated gradually through advisors, support missions, then combat troops. Each step justified by the last. None of them adding up to a clear definition of what winning actually looked like. And that was McNamara's real problem. In conventional wars, like in World War II, progress was obvious. Maps changed, armies surrendered, cities fell. Progress was visible. Vietnam had none of that. No front lines, no territory to hold. The enemy wasn't an army you could locate on a map. It was an idea embedded in the villages, in the jungle, and in the population itself. For a man who had built his entire career on the principle that if you can measure it, you can manage it, an invisible war was simply unacceptable. So as the war expanded, so did the obsession with metrics. How many sorties? How many enemy dead? How many villages cleared? Those numbers created the illusion of precision. McNamara and his team, 9,000 miles away in Washington, wanted measurable signs of progress. That seems reasonable until the easiest thing to measure becomes the thing that matters most. In Vietnam, that metric became body count. U.S. Army General William Westmoreland embraced this approach. The strategy would be based on attrition. If American firepower could kill the enemy faster than they could replace fighters, there would come a mathematical crossover point, a threshold where the North Vietnamese simply ran out of men. Win the ratio, win the war. On a whiteboard in the Pentagon, it's a reasonable theory. In practice, it created one of the most dangerous feedback loops in military history. Because here's what happens when you make body count the measure of success. Everyone starts optimizing for body count. Commanders need good numbers to advance their careers. Officers need good numbers for their commanders. Soldiers in the field needed good numbers for their officers. And so the numbers got really good. And this gave birth to search and destroy missions. For 4 years, from 1964 to 68, instead of holding ground or winning over the local population, units were sent out with one objective: find the enemy, kill them, and count the bodies. That was it. And so strategy wasn't measured by what you secured. It was measured by what you left behind. And the military wasn't winning a war. They were feeding a number. Estimates were rounded up. Civilians were reclassified. Soldiers later described a battlefield rule: if it's dead in Vietnamese, it's Viet Cong.
They didn't care what you were doing or how you were getting it. They wanted bodies. And that's where civilians came in also.
If 10 of us would go out and I'd come back with only 5 men, we'd lost half our men. And you couldn't say that you didn't see any enemy. So you could have only killed 1 enemy. And by the time it would get up to the high command, you killed 50 of them. So the body count's a bunch of shit.
McNamara did not invent dishonesty, but he built a system where the most measurable thing became the most important thing. And once that happens, the numbers stop describing the war, and they start shaping it. McNamara was not without critics. Among them was Hans Morgenthau, who advanced a realist approach that rejected McNamara's detached data points in favor of judgment, restraint, and recognition of what was happening on the ground. Morgenthau's view was that successful foreign policy required a deep understanding of power and human nature, not formulas and data. In his 1948 work, Politics Among Nations, he argued that national interest, not ideology or numerical targets, should guide policy. Morgenthau served under both Kennedy and Johnson, but was soon dismissed due to his criticism of McNamara's management by the numbers approach. And here's the number McNamara could never put into a spreadsheet. Ho Chi Minh had told the French before, and the Americans when they came, You will kill 10 of us for every one of us that kills you. But even at those odds, you will lose and we will win. That is not posturing. That is a completely different kind of calculation. The North Vietnamese weren't measuring kill ratios. They were fighting a completely different type of war. One built on endurance, legitimacy, and who believed deeply enough in what they were fighting for, especially when things got tough. And that's what happened. Tactically, the United States and its allies won the vast majority of every major battle in Vietnam. However, strategically, the US lost the war because it failed to achieve its political objective of a stable, non-communist South Vietnam. The body count could track the dead. It could not track belief. The US could not measure whether villagers trusted the government. They could not measure whether an army would stand once American support disappeared. They couldn't quantify what it meant to be fighting on your own land against a foreign power for the third consecutive generation. And so through the mid-1960s, Washington spoke in the language of metrics and momentum, while something very different was happening in the jungle. By the late 1960s, for the first time in history, Americans could watch the war happen in almost real time on television. And what they saw didn't match the story they were being told. And that gap had a name, the credibility gap. And it was about to become impossible to close. And then came Tet. On January 31, 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong guerrilla forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Over 100,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops infiltrated South Vietnam cities. The troops blended in, posing as civilians traveling to celebrate the Lunar New Year holiday known as Tet. More than 100 cities and towns were struck in one massive movement. Saigon was hit, the ancient imperial city of Hue was overrun and occupied for 26 days, even the US Embassy compound in Saigon, the symbolic heart of the US in Vietnam, was breached. And cameras were there to capture all of it.
What's the hardest part of it? Not knowing where they are, that's the worst. Riding around and running the sewers and the gutters anywhere. Be anywhere. Just hope you stay alive from day to day. Everybody just wants to go back home and go to school. That's about it.
You lost any friends?
Quite a few. We lost one the other day. The whole thing stinks, really.
Militarily, the offensive was a catastrophe for the communists. Over 45,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were killed. The US and South Vietnamese forces lost around 4,000 to 9,000 troops. By every metric McNamara's system had been built to track, the Allies won. General Westmoreland called it an American victory. And by the body count, he wasn't wrong. But strategically, it shattered the US public narrative. For 3 years, officials had described an enemy in decline. Enemy forces were depleted, morale was crumbling, the crossover point was coming, progress was being made. Tet proved the opposite. This wasn't the action of a broken army. It was the action of one that had been waiting. And for Americans watching at home, the message was unmistakable. The war was not what they'd been told. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in American journalism, flew to Vietnam to see it for himself. He came back and did something anchors almost never did. He editorialized. He told his audience that the war appeared to be a stalemate, and that the only rational way out was negotiation. When President Johnson heard what Cronkite said, he reportedly turned to an aide and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." And he was right. Just 1 month later, Robert McNamara, the longest-serving Secretary of Defense, stepped down on February 29, 1968, with a brief, emotional statement.
Mr. President, I cannot find words to express what lies in my heart today. And I think I'd better respond on another occasion.
And by March, President Johnson went on TV and told the country he would not seek re-election. The war would drag on for another 5 years, as the US slowly disengaged, shifting combat roles to the South Vietnamese, in a process called Vietnamization. All done while the US increased its aerial bombardment, expanding bombing campaigns into Cambodia and Laos, and striking the communist capital city of Hanoi itself. The Nixon administration called it peace with honor. Facing that relentless destruction, North Vietnam was forced to agree to a peace deal before the final withdrawal of military units in 1973. Leaving behind a heavily armed South Vietnamese army known as ARVN, the Nixon administration was soon paralyzed by the Watergate scandal, and the military support the US promised simply never came. By 1975, South Vietnam saw a rapid collapse. During the North's final spring offensive, Soviet and Chinese supplied tanks rolled into Saigon, captured the evacuated US embassy, and renamed the city Ho Chi Minh City. And just like that, after 20 years of struggle and 3.8 million total casualties, the conflict was officially over. The famous lesson of Tet is not that metrics are useless. It is that a war can be lost politically even when the numbers appear to support the strategy. The metrics hadn't just failed to capture reality. They had actively constructed a false one. Once body count became the central measure of progress, the logic of the war changed. Commanders wanted good numbers, political leaders wanted proof that the strategy was working. So the system rewarded the appearance of success. That is the danger of a single metric. It turns an entire organization into a machine for improving the metric instead of achieving the mission. And when the moment comes, as it did on the night of January 31st, 1968, the collapse isn't gradual, it's sudden, and it cannot be undone with better numbers. There's a term for this kind of mistake, the name for the gap between the data and the truth. It's aptly called the McNamara Fallacy. Measure what is easy, ignore what matters, then assume what matters must not exist because it can't be measured. Now, if you talk to modern data analysts, they'll tell you that McNamara was tracking the wrong things. Instead of just body counts, they argue that he should have been measuring what's known as dark data, the stuff that doesn't neatly fit into reporting systems, but actually decides who wins and loses, like the actual will of the North Vietnamese to endure hardships, which drove the conflict's longevity and undermined the US attrition strategy. Rather than body counts or enemy troop numbers, tracking the actual perception of the local population's attitude toward the Viet Cong and the attitude toward American forces. Instead of bomb tonnage, track their resupply efforts and their ability to replace losses, or how safe a village really was after dark once the patrols left. But here's the twist, and this is what makes the fallacy so dangerous. Even if McNamara had picked better metrics, the North Vietnamese were quick to adapt. They weren't just fighting a war, they were also hacking the data. They used decoy radio chatter to feed the US false leads. They figured out the US operation called Igloo White, a line of thousands of electronic troop detecting sensors, also called the McNamara line, and they would literally shake the trees and drop items nearby to trigger fake movement. They turned the US's own obsession with data against them, feeding the machine exactly what it wanted to see. So you had this perfect storm. Officers on the ground inflating numbers to hit quotas, and an enemy actively poisoning the well with misinformation. It didn't matter how fast the computers were, the data was compromised before it even hit the command centers. But this pattern does not just appear in war. It appears in business, education, climate policy, and in intelligence analysis. Anywhere performance is reduced to what can easily be counted. But in war, the consequences are catastrophic. Because war is not just logistics, it's politics, identity, fear, loyalty, corruption, and belief. It's the willingness of the people to keep fighting after the numbers stop making sense. Vietnam did not just expose a failure of strategy. It exposed a failure in how we decide what counts as reality.
The United States military are going to be pressured to give the machines more leeway in making those life or death decisions.
Now here's where the story stops being history. The McNamara fallacy never actually went away. It just got a technical upgrade. Today, that same obsession with metrics is coming to us through artificial intelligence. Modern militaries can process more data than McNamara ever imagined. AI can analyze satellite imagery, track movement patterns, listen to phone calls, read social media accounts, identify targets faster than any human staffer ever could. But it creates a familiar illusion. What it cannot reliably tell you is the human dimension, whether the people involved will fight, surrender, defect, or wait. Afghanistan made the warning even clearer. On paper, the Afghan National Security Forces numbered over 300,000 personnel. They were trained, equipped, and funded for years. But many units existed only on paper. Others were corrupt and lacked belief in the government they served. And when US support was withdrawn, the system collapsed within 11 days, as opposed to the estimated 3 to 6 months that were projected. This is the McNamara problem modernized. Because at least McNamara's spreadsheets were human-made. The choices were arguable. A sufficiently complex AI model doesn't feel that way. It feels like truth without an agenda. And slowly, skepticism starts to disappear. Not because anyone decides to stop questioning, but because the system makes questioning feel like the irrational choice. And that is how systems fail.
The information space is a war zone. Their aim is to take over the machinery of the state. Yeah, they're not trying to win a debate, they're trying to take over a country.
Not every enemy is looking for a win on an open battlefield. Honestly, they know better. Instead, they aim at that dark data, at the foundations, the trust in each other, the legitimacy of institutions. In the US, over 70% of the population is on social media. AI can generate convincing text, synthetic audio, realistic images, and waves of tailored content designed to push audiences in different directions at the same time, right from the phones in our pockets.
The more moral outrageous language you use, the more inflammatory language, contemptuous language, the more indignation you use, the more it will get shared.
In a democratic, open society, that can be as strategically important as any battlefield, because now the fight is not only over territory, it is over perception. And Vietnam proved this. The United States did not just fight an enemy army, it fought a war for credibility. If a public stops believing its leaders and the institutions telling it that the war is being won, then the enemy doesn't even need to hit the army first. Bullets still matter, but in an era of perception, information is the ultimate weapon. McNamara tried to bring order to war through data. What he learned too late and at an enormous cost was that the fog of war cannot simply be eliminated with more information. Sometimes the fog gets worse, because when people believe the numbers are enough, they stop asking the harder questions. That is the warning Vietnam leaves us. Not that data is dangerous, and not that numbers are useless. The warning is that data is not wisdom. And if leaders and governments build systems that can count everything except the things that actually win or lose wars, we risk taking the failure of Vietnam and scaling it up for the modern world, with faster machines, cleaner dashboards, and far greater confidence. If McNamara's story warns us of anything, it's that the human element never appears on screen. That is the ghost in the machine. And as Robert McNamara said towards the later of his career about Vietnam, we were wrong, terribly wrong. The numbers will keep getting better. The question is, will we?
If you enjoyed this journey through history, subscribe to Clear and Present History for more documentaries and untold stories from the past. A like or comment helps keep these stories from being forgotten. And if you believe the lessons of history still matter, becoming a supporting member helps us go deeper, funding the research and production that allow us to explore overlooked stories and preserve the hard-won wisdom of the past. From all of us at Clear and Present History and myself, Steve Christoff, thank you. Until next time.